Season 1, 2018. We are on episode 7 and 8 tonight. So almost finished with Season 1. I'm going to set up our camera phone here. Get the angle nice and good for everybody. Okay, ladies and gentlemen. Ghosts and goblins. Witches and wizards. Vampires and werewolves. Tonight, we are continuing Season 1 with Joe Bob of The Last Drive-In. Almost finished. Only got a couple episodes left in the season. Tonight, Joe Bob will be watching Blood Feast and also Basket Case. Interesting fact about Basket Case, main character is also named Dwayne. Spelled exactly like mine as well. But I believe Blood Feast was only made on a budget of about $25,000, and Basket Case was made on a budget of about $35,000. So a lot less budget than what we've been seeing in some of these other movies. The last stream, I also talked about like Nightmare on Elm Street and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Just to put it in perspective for you guys, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the budget that it was made on, I believe like around $400K, maybe even $300K. In today's money, because of inflation in America, you would need about $1 million to make the exact same movie in today's standards. The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, ladies and gentlemen, just to put it in perspective. And I also talked about, on the last Watchalong with Joe Bob, I also mentioned how a long time ago on TNT, when there was Monster Vision, I got to watch Joe Bob do the Friday the 13th movie reviews. And the interesting thing about that, I don't even think they had the rights to part 3 or 4. It was one of the Friday the 13th movies that they couldn't watch. So they did skip a movie in the marathon because they couldn't get the rights to the Friday the 13th movie to show on television. Exact same shit is kind of happening here today with my channel. Unfortunately, guys, we will no longer be doing the WWE watch-alongs. Maybe even, AEW as well, but it's just upsetting that none of the videos ever get to see the light of day. I'm sick of YouTube removing them because of copyright reasons or whatever. Like I said, we're really just hanging out and trying to watch some of this stuff and talk about it together. But, at least the Joe Bob stuff is still appropriate. At least it's still allowed for the time being. So, again, these are more edited versions of the episodes. We won't be seeing any of the movies themselves tonight, but we will get to listen to Joe Bob talk about them. So I thank everybody for being here with me tonight and spending some time to listen to Joe Bob and just to hang out. I always enjoy a good laugh with Joe Bob. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, once again for joining me. And we will start the episode. Tonight, we are watching episode 7 and 8. Season 1, 2018 of The Last Drive-In with Joe Bob. And again, ladies and gentlemen, all of these episodes can be found on Shudder.
This next one is for you. And now, if you've never seen Blood Feast, I got to get you ready for this. It's a bad slasher flick. It's a really bad slasher flick, like painfully bad. But it's the first slasher flick written and directed by my friend Herschel Gordon-Lewis. Herschel died in late 2016 at the officially announced age of 90, but he was always hiding his age and he always looked 50, so I wouldn't be surprised if the real number was 10 years higher. Herschel was a tall, elegant, urbane, intellectual guy with a sharp wit who would have been amazed and flattered that the New York Times, of all places, took note of his death and published a long obituary. And I was amazed by that as well, and pissed off, because that's the newspaper that ignored his existence during the years when he was making films, years when even a negative review would have helped his box office. So now that he's safely dead, they're giving him credit for inspiring John Carpenter, influencing Wes Craven, influencing Quentin Tarantino, which means they're just proving what idiots they are all over over again. Herschel Gordon Lewis had about as much influence on Quentin Tarantino as the inventor of the three-pronged pitchfork had on Friday the 13th. If Wes Craven even watched any of Herschel's films, it was most likely to use them as a horrible warning not to oversaturate the screen with phosphorescent stage blood. John Carpenter is a superb craftsman. Herschel was a businessman. He had trouble understanding cinematic principles unaltered since the time of D.W. Griffith. So I have to wonder if that obituary was some kind of weird times cleansing ritual. You know, they were trying to awkwardly deal with a pop culture hero in some way that won't offend the ballet critic. So anyway, I only knew Herschel for the last 30 years of his life. And it began on the day I went to Plantation, Florida, to tell him that 90% of his films had been rescued from warehouses, and they were about to be released in a video series that was hosted by me and distributed by this London company called Strand Video. So Herschel answers the door at his stylish condo. He's impeccably dressed as usual in his trademark blazer and his tie, and he motions me into the kitchen so that his wife, Margot, can't hear us. And he whispers, she's not crazy about this aspect of my life. And then he says, you're going to release these films? How? And more to the point, why would you do this? Because like many filmmakers of his generation, Herschel was under the impression that films are just disposable. They're of no value once they've been played off around the country. And he hadn't saved any of his prints. He'd long ago sold the ancillary rights. He was primarily a marketer, not a filmmaker, and his genius was the ad campaign. All of Herschel's films were bait and switch. They never quite delivered whatever the lurid posters promised. And his greatest achievement was the release of Blood Feast on July 19th, 1963 at the Bellevue Drive-In in Peoria, Illinois. Now, I'm going to tell you this story, and you're going to appreciate the movie a lot more when I do.
The film debuted in Illinois, ladies and gentlemen. It debuted in Illinois, again, on the East Coast. We are very famous for our slasher movies. We take pride in the slasher genre, in horror, okay? The East Coast, responsible for some of the biggest slasher films of all time. And I know some of you out there might want to say, well, they filmed Nightmare on Elm Street in California. Well, guess what? Nightmare on Elm Street takes place in Springwood, Ohio. Okay? It's Ohio, ladies and gentlemen. It's on the East Coast. It still had the East Coast inspiration in the movie. And if you want to take it a step further than that, one of my favorite horror movies of all time, probably even movie, one of my favorites of all time, Freddy vs. Jason, okay? They filmed Freddy vs. Jason in Vancouver. It wasn't even shot here in America. They filmed it in Canada. So you want to be all accurate? You want to be fucking horror movie experts? Ladies and gentlemen, Freddy vs. Jason was probably bigger in Canada than it was here in America. And it's still one of my favorite movies of all time.
Chain of drive-ins. They were owned by Stanford Kohlberg, who was a P.T. Barnum type who tried everything from pony rides to hot air balloons to fireworks shows. He did anything to popularize his theaters. And it was Kohlberg who put up the money for this film, $24,500 to be painfully precise. Now, it didn't have much going for it in the way of acting, plot, production values, but it had one new element, blood. Not just a little squib on the shirt when somebody dies, but gouts of blood, gallons of blood, spurting blood, gurgling out of bodies in extreme close-up as a maniac Egyptian caterer named Fuad Ramses slaughters virginal girls and prepares a cannibal feast from their body parts. As the advertising poster put it, nothing so appalling in the annals of horror. You'll recoil and shudder as you witness the slaughter and mutilation of nubile young girls in a weird and horrendous ancient rite. An admonition: if you are the parent or guardian of an impressionable adolescent, do not bring him or permit him to see this motion picture. And and also, introducing Connie Mason. You read about her in Playboy. More grisly than ever in blood color. You get the idea. So, on the day of the premiere, Herschel and his partner, Dave Friedman, they got curious about how this new kind of movie would fare. And so they made this last second decision to drive down to the Peoria Drive-In from their Chicago office. So they hop into Herschel's Chrysler Imperial. They stop to pick up their wives, who despise the film, by the way. And when they get to Plank Road, which is about a mile from the theater, they run into a traffic jam. Okay, so at first they thought there was an accident ahead. Then it slowly dawned on them. All the cars are lined up to see Blood Feast. A legend was born. Now, what's interesting about that story is that the movie was obviously a success before anybody had actually seen it. The crowds thronged the theater on the basis of the ad campaign. So it did continue to make money. It made $17,000 for that week it played in Peoria, followed by bookings over the next 15 years that earned an estimated $7 million. So the profit was 286 times return on investment. But it wasn't really a blockbuster.
286 times profit, ladies and gentlemen.
Impressive primarily for its sheer longevity. It moved around the country 1 week at a time. So as late as 1980, it was still turning up in drive-ins. Often it was on a double bill with Tom Laughlin's Born Losers. But unlike most cult movies, you're not likely to find many film buffs who actually saw it during that first release, because it wasn't that kind of movie. In the cities, Blood Feast played grindhouses, and in rural areas, it played drive-ins, often as a second feature or even a third feature when the so-called family audience had already gone home. So it was an almost entirely male clientele, bored and lonely seekers of cheap thrills, not the kind of guys who write cult film memoirs. So I'm going to tell some more Herschel stories as we watch the movie. But remember, this was made by a man who was trying to become the most disgusting filmmaker in history. And because Herschel had already made a big pile of money on nudist camp films. You remember those where 6 ugly people with acne play volleyball in the nude for an hour and a half? But the bottom dropped out of those when nudity became acceptable in regular movies. So like any good exploitation movie maker, Herschel was looking for the next wave of movies that your mother didn't want you to see. And he decided the secret was violence without any socially redeeming value whatsoever.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so right there, Joe Bob describes the director a little bit more. He states the director really got popular and really got famous off of like nudie camp films, right? The type of shit you would probably see playing at a Playboy mansion. And after that, his main goal was just to become the most disgusting director of all time. And an implement of that was also violence, okay? Sounds a little bit like Quentin Tarantino's inspiration, but again, Quentin Tarantino and John Carpenter, directors like that, probably had little to no feelings for these kind of movies. At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, like Joe Bob said, most of these kind of movies were played at the end of like a drive-in, like maybe the third film that you watch and everybody's already gone home, they've already gone to sleep. Maybe even here in America, like the big cities, you would see it in a grindhouse kind of setting. But again, it was not the most popular movie. It did see a lot of return on investment, but probably not the kind of thing you would just see playing on ABC or anything like that.
And a little sex as well. In this case,
HBO, fucking stars.
And on that fateful night in Peoria, when everybody was when the movie first started and everybody was kind of making fun of it, they were sitting on their car hoods and making jokes about the lame acting and the melodramatic music. And then about 20 minutes into the movie, this girl gets her tongue ripped out on camera, and people got sick, and their girlfriends asked to be taken home immediately, and their parents were outraged. And so the next night, even more cars were lined up for miles trying to get in. So what Herschel did is he discovered America's fascination with slashing, stabbing, whipping, impaling, eye gouging, dismemberment, scalping, way before everybody else did. And the movie became a cult classic for its place in the history of gore. All right. Blood Feast is the sensitive story of Fuad Ramses, who's collecting female body parts so he can stir up a cannibal stew in honor of Ishtar the goddess, which looks suspiciously like a department store mannequin that's been spray painted gold. And Fuad is played by an actor named Mal Arnold, who insisted on doing the world's worst Bela Lugosi imitation while bugging out his eyes like Elmer Fudd and doing the whole movie with an exaggerated limp.
Now, cannibal movies in the horror genre are one of my favorite, subgenres. I love stuff about cannibal films, going all the way back to Cannibal Holocaust, and then, you have spin-offs of that like not Quentin Tarantino, but the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then Eli Roth has even done the Green Inferno, which again have just been some of my favorite films when it comes to horror.
Including sequences where he has to limp while he runs. So let's look at the drive-in totals and get it rolling. We have 7 dead bodies, 2 breasts, body hacking, eye gouging, beach scalping, tongue ripping, kidnapping, virgin torture, blackened leg pizza, body part stew, 5,000-year flashback sequence featuring virgin sacrifice and heart ripping, gratuitous boa constrictor, gratuitous lecture on Egyptian theology, gratuitous bikini girl segment, butcher knife foo, broadsword foo, machete foo, cleaver foo, bullwhip foo, trash compactor foo, and the rarely practiced cake knife foo. Drive-In Academy Award nominations for Mal
cake
Arnold
knife foo,
as Fuad Ramses, caterer, author of the famous book Ancient Weird Religious Rites, and maniac body part collector who says, "Have you ever had an Egyptian feast? It has not been served for 5,000 years. And now we shall have the flavor, the special flavor, seasoned just right for you, O Mother of the Veiled Darkness." William Kerwin as Pete, the chain-smoking detective who has most of the best lines in the movie, including, "Well, we're just working with a homicidal maniac, that's all." And, "Well, Frank, this looked like one of those long, hard ones." Scott H. Hall as the police chief for saying, "A pathological killer on the loose. This man's uncanny." And this time he took the brains. Now, what kind of creature would do that? Connie Mason as Suzette, who's excited about her party. Only I was reading about all those murders, and it takes the joy out of everything. It's terrible. And, "Hey, you wouldn't sacrifice me on this altar, would you?" And, of course, Herschel Gordon Lewis for writing, directing, composing the organ and timpani soundtrack, plus some really bad trombone in there, and for shooting it in 9 days at the Suez Motel in Miami Beach.
The man wrote, directed, and composed the soundtrack. He was like a young John Carpenter in the making.
4 stars for its place in history.
Joe Bob's going to give it 4 stars.
And I'll have more amazing Blood Feast trivia at the breaks. Herschel was actually such a perfectionist that he didn't like any of the commercially available stage blood. So he found this company called Barfred Cosmetics in Miami. I love that name because it Barf Red, Barfred Cosmetics. And he convinced them to create a new type of blood according to his own recipe. And one of the qualities of this blood is that actors could hold it in their mouth and safely ingest it. But he failed to inform the cast that its base ingredient was kaopectate. So anyway, the blood in the movie is bright red, like candy apple red. And Herschel was proud of that blood, the blood realism, he really believed it. But, and I told him this one time, blood is not red. I mean, it's red for 2 seconds after it comes out of a wound. Am I thinking about this too much? But, watch Forensic Files, because it's magenta or something. Lilac. It's lilac color. Maybe purplish carnelian. I can't keep doing this. I'm going to start singing I Feel Pretty in a minute.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, so now we get into the first movie of the night, Blood Feast. We're going to hear what Joe Bob has to say about it. First segment break at 17:17.
I love that guy. Gene Courtier is the actor's name. The boy on the beach who can't stop hanging on the cop's lapels as he dissolves into hysterics. Here's something frightening about this film. The most professional actor in the film with the most experience is Mal Arnold, the guy playing the Egyptian caterer. And by the way, that Sphinx at the beginning, that was out in front of the Suez Motel on Collins Avenue in Miami Beach, which is where most of the scenes in the movie were filmed. All right, I'm going to tell you how this movie happened. Herschel Gordon Lewis was an advertising executive in Chicago, and his friend David Friedman was a carnival operator and a film publicist, and the two of them started up an indie film company in 1960 with a movie called The Prime Time, starring 7 of the ugliest girls ever to appear on film. That's according to Herschel, even though one of those girls was Karen Black in her movie debut. And they followed that up with what was called an artists and models programmer called Living Venus, starring Harvey Korman. And then they made a silly burlesque film called The Adventures of Lucky Pierre that earned $175,000 on an investment of $7,000. And then they hit their stride when they discovered Nudie Cuties. Now, that was the almost unbearably boring genre that flourished from 1960 to 1963. And because a series of court decisions had allowed nudity on the screen for the first time, but only if the film took place entirely within a nudist camp. This led Herschel to Florida, where he made Daughter of the Sun, Nature's Playmates, and Boing. Yes, the title means what you think it means. But by 1962, the nudist camp fad was starting to fade. And so Friedman and Lewis went in search of new genres.
By the 70s, you couldn't make any more nudie camp films. They weren't that popular with the American audience. They were starting to fade off. So what does the director do? He takes his talents to South Beach, quite literally down in Miami, and starts making horror movies.
So that fall, they shot Scum of the Earth, about a gang of pornographers who lure young college girls into posing for dirty pictures. But their big break came when Friedman hooked up with the owner of the top burlesque theater in Cincinnati, Eli Jackson. So Eli Jackson wants to finance a nudie film starring his wife, who was a stripper named Virginia Bell, better known as Ding Dong Bell. Her measurements were 48, 24, 36. So well known nationally that she commanded $1,500 a week on the burlesque stage. So Herschel and Friedman, they make a quick deal to shoot the film as just hired guns. And the finished product is lost, but it was called Belle, Bear, and Beautiful. But it was really just an excuse to put together a cast and crew with somebody else's money so they could use the extra time to make Blood Feast. So the two key performers in Blood Feast were Connie Mason, the Playboy playmate who was so lifeless and unprepared that she just drove Herschel insane. He told me she never knew a single line, not one, ever. And then the second actor was Mal Arnold. Now, Arnold was a local actor. He seemed okay at the interview. He'd been an extra in one of the nudie cuties that they made called Goldilocks and the Three Bears, B-A-R-E-S. But when the camera rolled, he insisted on using that Bela Lugosi accent, bugging out his Groucho Marx eyebrows, and using that hokey limp. So a great deal of the movie's cult value, in my opinion, is created by the yin-yang effect of the beautiful Connie Mason's deadpan non-acting with the slimy-haired Mal Arnold's delirious overacting. And fortunately, the facade of the Suez Motel featured this garishly painted plastic replica of the Sphinx, which you could shoot from below at dusk, and you almost be made to look like the real Sphinx. So that's the opening shot in the movie. The more daunting task was creating the shrine to the goddess Ishtar, which that scene we just saw where Fuad says, "I am your slave, my lady of the dark moon." So a department store mannequin was painted yellow, dressed in vaguely Arabian attire, but it didn't look menacing or even remotely interesting. So Friedman solved the problem by driving down to the Miami Serpentorium and purchasing a 7-foot-long Colombian boa constrictor for $30, and they draped it over the mannequin. Still doesn't look that creepy. And then they used the snake in a couple of other scenes for no particular reason save ambiance. So Herschel had shot 2 complete features in 16 days, and 3 months later, he was killing them in Peoria. Okay, I'm sure you're dying to know what happens next, so let's get back to the classic Blood Feast.
And the movie review for
The
Blood
actor who was
Feast will
supposed to play
continue.
the police chief, he didn't show up at all. So Friedman asked one of his carny buddies to step in and be the police chief. So that
One of the actors who was actually casted as the police officer never even showed up to the set, never even wanted to film a scene. So apparently they got one of their carny buddies to come along and do it, probably for a lot cheaper too.
that's Scott H. Hall as the police chief, just tossing off those one-liners like, "Pete, this is the worst yet. I don't know what to make of it. 7 killings in 2 weeks. Young girls, and each killing more brutal than the other," which is, of course, exactly the way cops talk to one another. Scott's day job was as a barker at the sideshows at the Ringling Brothers Circus. So, but actually, my favorite line in the movie is the other cop who says, "Well, Frank, this looks like one of those long, hard ones." They just don't write them like that anymore.
And like I said, they thought that this kind of dialogue and script was going to be the inspiration for Quentin Tarantino. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I will be right back. I just have to step outside for one moment. All right, my apologies. Everybody had to check on my dog Grizzly Bear. It's going a little crazy. Next segment break, 35 minutes.
Oh, Pete. Connie Mason. If you were watching closely in the living room scene between Suzette and Dorothy, that's Connie Mason, the Playboy Playmate, as Suzette. Connie couldn't remember her lines, so she's actually reading them off of a table lamp. But of course, the money scene was the tongue ripping. And I don't see exactly how Foulon did that, because he appears to just stick his fingers in her mouth, and instead of her biting them, which any normal person would do, she just moans a lot until he rips the tongue out. The night before they shot that scene, they still hadn't cast the victim yet. So Herschel told Dave Friedman he needed a good-looking girl with a huge mouth. And the reason he needed the huge mouth was that he'd purchased a sheep's tongue, and then he had marinated the sheep's tongue in stage blood and strawberry preserves and minced cranberries. And now this concoction had been sitting in the refrigerator for 3 days, and it was starting to get smelly and disgusting. So Friedman went to the Playboy Club in Miami, and as it turned out, his waitress at the Playboy Club was a blonde Scandinavian named Astrid Olsen. And he instantly noticed that she had a really big mouth. So he made the deal with her. She agreed to show up the next day for filming, but she came to the set with a boyfriend that Herschel referred to as the Neanderthal. So Friedman said this boyfriend thought it was going to be a big starring part in a big Paramount picture or something, but it was one day's work. So they were happy with the girl's work. She held the sheep's tongue in her mouth. The stage blood was in there. A bunch of other stuff was in there until Foulon could properly rip it out and make movie history. And then she and the boyfriend asked Herschel, well, when will she be needed for the rest of her role? And he told him, no, you understand. That was your role. So, for the first 20 years after this film first came out, it was considered Drek because, it was Drek. But then around 1983, it suddenly became immortal. And that was partly due to the punk rock scene, because quite a few metal bands recorded songs in tribute to famous scenes in Herschel's movies. Like the group 10,000 Maniacs, that was formed as a tribute to the follow-up film to Blood Feast, which was 2,000 Maniacs, but the band got the name wrong. They called it 10,000 Maniacs. I can't really explain why Blood Feast became popular with a new generation, but I think it's because the movie was just despised and gross. So by the time he became famous in the early 80s, Herschel is not aware of any of this because he's retired from show business. He settled in South Florida. He actually made a small fortune as one of the world's leading authorities on direct mail marketing, better known as junk mail. He wrote books on junk mail. He conducted seminars on it around the world. He hired himself out at $10,000 a letter if you wanted him to write your junk mail piece. And the three principles of effective junk mail are...
Almost sounds like trying to pay actors or celebrities for like a cameo nowadays, or like one of those little videos where they just shout you out. But yeah, he was expecting about $10,000 for you to get a piece of junk mail from him.
Told me, were fear, guilt, and greed. So his chosen craft was not that different from an exploitation film campaign. But when I first met Herschel during that memorable encounter in Plantation, he spoke very fondly of his old films, but he was not aware that they were famous. It was kind of like a sideline to him. And he always spoke like a professor. He had the perfect King's English, and he actually had a master's degree in journalism and a PhD in psychology. He could have legitimately billed himself as Dr. Lewis. And in the 50s, he taught English and humanities at Mississippi State before he decided he'd rather get rich. So his first jobs were in media. He worked at radio stations in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, and then he became a producer at WKY, Oklahoma City, and then he became a copywriter for a Chicago ad agency, and he was just ready to go out on his own when he met Dave Friedman, that carny from Alabama, and together they formed Mid-Continent Films. And Herschel's fellow journalists were not kind to this film. The reviews use words like inept, crude, unprofessional, and fiasco. And Kevin Thomas of the Los Angeles Times said, Blood Feast is a blot on the American film industry. In production, exhibition, and promotion, it is an example of the independently made exploitation film at its very worst. It is an insult to the intelligence of all but readers of horror comic books. For a true exploitation genius like Herschel, there's no finer promotion than to be called a blot on the American film industry. So he was now the king of this particular molehill, and like Harry Kerr, the indie theater king in the Carolinas, he played the picture in all 350 of his drive-ins. Herschel printed up vomit bags inscribed, "You may need this when you see Blood Feast." And even though 500,000 of those vomit bags were passed out at screenings, they're quite valuable today as collector's items. There were protests against the film in San Diego and Tampa, but otherwise, Blood Feast was remarkably non-controversial.
Does anybody still have their vomit bag from when they watched Blood Feast? I need to know. It's one of the most valuable items in memorabilia for horror. All right? We need to see the vomit bag that was passed out to the drive-in spectators.
Especially when you compare it to the earlier protests over the nudie films, because Americans hate sex more than they hate violence. We know that, right? So, and in fact, things were so slow in Sarasota that Herschel tried to stir things up by swearing out an injunction against his own film, alleging it violated local obscenity laws. And he expected to get a couple days publicity out of that stunt, but the presiding judge surprised him by granting the injunction. So he had to actually fight in court to get the injunction lifted. Okay, that's enough Herschel trivia. I could go on all night, but I'm sure you're dying to find out how the romance between Detective Pete and Bimbo Suzette turns out. So let's go back to the movie. And you know, Sarasota, speaking of Sarasota, you know, that's a circus town, right? That's where the circus goes in the winter. So you would think they would like Blood Feast, right? But a few years back, I hosted a screening of Blood Feast at the Sarasota Film Festival, right? I thought the city would take pride in its little slice of exploitation history. And I got cussed out by some really well-dressed upper-class women who made a big show. They couldn't just leave. They had to make a big show of walking out of the theater right after that tongue-ripping scene. I mean, come on, ladies. It was 50 years ago. Have some imagination, right? Have some fun. You know, and the thing about it is, when you're the big movie expert and the audience cusses you out, They do not invite you back to the Frou Frou Film Festival in Sarasota.
Joe Bob was not invited to return to the movie festivals in Sarasota. Next segment break, 52 minutes into the movie.
Blackened pizza leg. If you're following closely, you'll recognize that as the leg of Sandy Sinclair, who was hacked up in the bathtub in the very first scene of the movie. There's so many great lines in the movie. Well, she's dead now. Stop your sniveling. Stanford Kohlberg, the drive-in owner in Illinois, was so happy with the way Blood Feast turned out that he gave Friedman and Lewis money for 2 more gore films, both of which were better films, but neither of which became as famous. 2000 Maniacs is about a southern town where a Civil War massacre took place, and once every 100 years, the dead martyrs rise from their graves to take revenge on Yankee tourists. It's the redneck version of Brigadoon. Color Me Blood Red was one of the many versions of Bucket of Blood, the Roger Corman classic from 1959, about an artist who has to kill in order to make his works more lifelike. But success breeds discontent in the exploitation film world, and so there were creative conflicts among Lewis, Friedman, and Kohlberg, and after those 3 gore films, they would never again work together. It's kind of sad. Friedman moved to Los Angeles, and he partnered with exploitation pioneer Dan Sonny, and the two of them founded the notorious Pussycat Theaters chain. Lewis went back to the advertising business and made films whenever he could, and neither man would ever have the impact alone that they had as a team. Herschel ended up directing 38 films. Now, you wouldn't know that because he always used a fake name. Like the screenwriter of Blood Feast is Allison Louise Down. Well, that was Herschel's wife at the time. She wasn't a writer. She didn't write it. Herschel wrote it. Allison was also known as Vicky Miles. She appeared in most of Herschel's films. In this one, she's one of the extras at the lecture on ancient Egyptian religious rites. But Herschel would make any film for a price. He even made a couple of children's films. The Magic Land of Mother Goose and Jimmy the Boy Wonder. He was just a hired gun on those.
So it sounds like after the director made this movie, him and his partner continued to do 2 more movies of a similar style, but after that, their teamwork was pretty much finished, and the director kind of struggled after that. Even though he made close to like 40 movies, he was really just taking whatever opportunity he could get at that point to probably make a paycheck. So after these kind of movies, both of their careers really start going downhill because they couldn't accomplish the same magic that they did when they worked together as opposed to just being solos. So
films about the sexual revolution called Miss Nymphet's Zap-In and A Girl, a Boy, and the Pill. He went through a cornpone phase with moonshine epics like This Stuff'll Kill Ya, Moonshine Mountain, and Year of the Yahoo, which was, by the way, a precursor of Bob Roberts. He made the first all-female motorcycle gang movie, She Devils on Wheels. He made one of the most brutal films about teen gangs just for the hell of it, as well as a little gem of a movie called Suburban Roulette. It was about wife swapping. One of his strangest films, on a resume full of strange films, is Linda and Abilene, a nude lesbian western shot at the Spahn Movie Ranch while the Manson family was still living there. But he always returned to gore. I mean, he made movies called A Taste of Blood, The Gruesome Twosome, and it was partly because he was fascinated by the magician's challenge of creating new realistic effects that had never been seen before. So if Blood Feast was the Citizen Kane of gore, then The Wizard of Gore in 1972 was Herschel's Midsummer Night's Dream. That was his final experiment in gory special effects, his swan song. And that same year, he moved from Chicago to Florida, and he got out of the exploitation business for good. Okay, the cops have identified Fuad Ramses because, Ishtar. Alert all cops. I think we've got our killer. So it's time for the thrilling conclusion to Blood Feast. Okay, roll it. Will Connie Mason live or die? Will Mrs. Fremont ingest the blackened leg? So many questions to answer about this. Will the department store mannequin come to life? We get to see the snake again. You want to know how sick I am? One time I went looking for the Suez Motel in Miami Beach to see if the miniature Sphinx was still there. I had this old postcard. It had the address on it, and unfortunately, the Suez Motel was gone. But you know what's there? You know what's there in its place? The Trump Grand condominium complex, the Trump Palace condominium complex, and the Trump International Beach Resort. It took 3 multi-million-dollar Donald Trump resort properties to replace the fabled Suez Motel where film history was made. The man is a menace.
The man's a menace. And these are the final reviews after the end credits.
He died a fitting death, like the garbage he was. But the partygoers will have to eat hamburgers tonight. Typical of a Herschel Gordon Lewis film, he has that closing line, like the garbage he was, and then he has Pete the detective spend 2 minutes repeating the entire plot. As David F. Friedman, the producer, once said, Blood Feast has been cussed, discussed, dismissed, denounced, decried, despised, disdained, and acclaimed. After Blood Feast became a cult legend, various writers would try to assess its place in film history by citing its supposed influence on much better films made by much better filmmakers, and all of that was just bullshit, because Herschel and his signature film would not be remembered at all were it not for 2 guys. One is Jimmy Maslon, the co-owner of Hollywood Book and Poster, the memorabilia shop on Hollywood Boulevard. Jimmy painstakingly searched for, located, and lovingly restored all the rare prints of Herschel Gordon Lewis films that had been scattered to the 4 winds once Stanford Kohlberg passed away and after Herschel retired. And in some cases, there was only 1 remaining print of the film, and it was usually found in the attic of somebody who had bought it at a bankruptcy sale when a regional sub-distributor went out of business or something. And the second man is Frank Henenlotter, the Greenwich Village exploitation director, best known for his own cult classic, Basket Case. Frank brought Herschel out of obscurity in the early 80s, and he celebrated his films at a special festival staged at the Waverly Theater on 6th Avenue. It's today known as IFC Cinema. We still call it the Waverly, but they call it the IFC Cinema. And but without Maslon, the films wouldn't exist. Without Henenlotter, the man would still be unknown. And both of them collaborated on a 2010 documentary called The Godfather of Gore, which is the best way to enjoy Herschel's career without having to actually sit through Herschel's movies. So I'm going to give the last word on Blood Feast to Herschel himself. He once told me, Blood Feast is an accident of history. We didn't deliberately set out to establish a new genre. Rather, we were escaping from an old one. Blood Feast is like a Walt Whitman poem. It's no good, but it's the first of its type. And that's what I loved about that's what I loved about Herschel. No matter how many bad movies he made, no matter how many people told him they were good movies, and no matter how much he would have liked to have been a real director, he couldn't kill the old English professor that knew better. Okay, we're rolling now. How many flicks have we done? 7, 8. I'm not even sleepy, because
all right, ladies and gentlemen,
will wake you up. So
we're getting ready for our 8th movie review here from Joe Bob.
Darcy, I love this cosplay thing that you've been. This is your best one yet. Anyway, you've been monitoring the overnight chatter. So what do we got?
Everybody loves you.
Don't be sarcastic.
Everyone is loving the marathon so far.
All right, everyone.
Well, there's this one dude who didn't like Daughters of Darkness and thought it was kind of slow.
It is. It's slow as fuck. So that's
slow as fuck.
Here, read this
That's
one.
an accurate
It's
description.
Okay, this letter comes in from Nick Leaners of Minneapolis. And he says, Joe Bob, I heard from James Rolfe that you were trying to get Monster Vision back.
James Rolfe, ladies and gentlemen, if anybody doesn't know, James Rolfe is the angry video game nerd on YouTube.
James Rolfe does Cinemassacre on YouTube. I loved your show growing up, and I got a funny story for you. When I was 13, my friend and I loved watching Friday the 13th, the final chapter, and Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3 that his older college-aged brother had on VHS. But those movies had naked boobs bouncing around on the doomed horror co-eds in various scenes, so we knew we couldn't watch them around either of our parents. Then Monster Vision had a Friday the 13th marathon, and I saw Part 6 on TV. I was so excited because I watched the whole thing, and it was full of goofy kills, guts, and exploding Jasons, and no boobs. Finally, it was one that I could buy for myself and watch at home. So I went out to the store that week and bought it. I put it in the VCR at home, and I had to sit there with both my parents stone-facing through about a half dozen scenes of the good stuff that I naively didn't realize they censored from the TV version. Hilarious only in hindsight, but Monster Vision back would be great. Hope you can convince the stiffs to take a chance on it again. Well, Nick, thank you for that story about the 13-year-old hormonal behavior encouraged by my show. I'm afraid Monster Vision will never come back. TNT canceled me at the height of my popularity, so now the people must suffer. And every time you turn on TNT and they're showing a Tyler Perry movie, I didn't do that to you. I didn't do that. I never did anything like that to you. Yes, I showed Super Beast. I admit that one. But on the whole, I kept America healthy. And you don't have that anymore.
But what we're doing now is fun.
Yes, the last drive-in. And it is fun. And after tonight, it's over.
That's so sad.
People just have to buck up. So thank you, Darcy. You may return to your cubicle. And can people talk to you on the social media?
They can. I try to answer.
Okay. Darcy is standing by, guys, all weekend long. Are you going to stay up with me?
All weekend long, Joe Bob.
Okay, excellent. This is going to be one of those. This is going to be one of those long, hard ones. We'll be back in a couple minutes with the story of a Siamese twin who lives in a basket and eats people's faces off. You know what I'm talking about. The debut film of the man I just mentioned who did the Herschel show at the Waverly Theater, now known as the IFC Cinema, Frank Henenlotter. Stay with us. Only 347 more hours to go in the Joe Bob Marathon. So did I tell you guys the one about the history professor and the psychology professor at the nudist camp? The history professor and the psychology professor are sitting on a sun deck at a nudist resort. And the history professor turns to the psychology professor and he says, "Have you read Marx?" And the psychology professor says, "Yeah, I think it's from the wicker chairs." You have to think about it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. Episode 8, the next movie review here from Joe Bob is going to be on Basket Case. But I just want to take a second to mention, I think it was really cool that Joe Bob mentioned James Rolfe here. If anybody doesn't know, James Rolfe, of course, runs the YouTube channel Cinemassacre, also known originally as the Angry Nintendo Nerd, then switched over to the Angry Video Game Nerd, AVGN for short. But what's interesting about James Rolfe, the Angry Video Game Nerd, he's really one of my main inspirations for getting started on YouTube. Not just aside from filmmaking, but also just the way he would review video games in general, I think was really interesting. It really hasn't been done a similar style ever since him in a way. You compare the Cinemassacre and the James Rolfe kind of style to like an IGN, it's night and day, ladies and gentlemen. And James Rolfe, he originally just wanted to do like the worst video games, like you're not going to see like AAA popular video game movie reviews from him. He really wanted to sit down and play some of the worst video games known to mankind and then just make videos on that. which I also thought was really cool because, again, you get that kind of similar style here with horror movies and the horror genre. Again, not all of the movies are going to be the most popular, the most high budget, but you're going to get put on, and you're going to get to know more about some of the movies that never really got to make it to the theaters that you would watch, like a Friday the 13th or Halloween. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are on episode 8 of The Last Drive-In with Joe Bob. He's going to be watching Basket Case and reviewing it. We will take about a 1.5, 2-minute break, and then we will be right back with episode 8 of The Last Drive-In with Joe Bob. Thank you once again, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me tonight, and we'll be right back. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, ghosts and goblins, witches and wizards, vampires and werewolves. Let's watch Joe Bob's movie review on Basket Case, which again I believe only happened on a $35,000 budget. That is completely out of standards today for what you would make a horror movie on. And again, the main character named Dwayne. So there's an interesting fact about that.
I would like all of us to take a moment of remembrance for the Highway 183 drive-in in Irving, Texas. Gone but not forgotten. We were all there, right? We remember the barf stains on the speaker poles like it was yesterday. We remember how they always sweeped up the condom wrappers so the children could play on the teeter-totter. We remember Gerald, the security guard, who was released on weekends to work there and would always have words of drive-in wisdom like, never walk up on a baby blue El Camino with 2 men inside unless you want to see things described in the Old Testament. That was Gerald, and that was the Highway 183 drive-in, which was named after a road like God intended. All great drive-ins are named after transportation corridors. Now, if you're from out of state, then you may not know that the 183 was right across from Texas Stadium, which was the greatest football stadium in the world that featured a hole in the roof that blinded the eyes of the quarterback. And if you went about 5 minutes down the airport freeway and looked behind the world's largest stack of car-top carriers, that was the 183. We had statistics at one time showing that more babies born on welfare were conceived at the 183 than any other venue in the Southwest, and that includes the Tonight Motel in East Tulsa. But there was one night back in 1982 when the eyes of the world were on the 183, and no, it was not the night that Lonnie Stebbins clubbed Animal Barker with a deer rifle. The media got that whole thing wrong anyway. They said Lonnie pistol whipped him. But I witnessed the weapon. It was the Remington 740. Animal got rifle whipped because all the time it was happening, I was thinking the autoloader is never going to work again on that rifle. So no, the event I'm talking about is the world premiere of Basket Case. All right, a little history is in order. I was one of 2 movie critics at the very first screening of Basket Case at the Cannes Film Festival in France. The other one was Rex Reed. Now, Rex never reviewed it, but on his way out of the screening room, a guy asked him, "What'd you think of the movie?" And he said, "This film is sick." So it turns out the guy who had asked him the question was Frank Henenlotter, the director of Basket Case. And Frank took that quote, "This film is sick," and put it all over the posters. "This film is sick," Rex reads. So Rex got furious. But meanwhile, I'm doing my thing in Texas, waiting for the movie to arrive so I can promote the heck out of it. And Frank is having a hell of a time getting the movie noticed. In fact, the distributor did a re-edit of it. He took all the gore scenes out of it, and he tried to sell it as a pure comedy. So one day I get this call from New York. "How can we arrange the world drive-in premiere of Basket Case?" And I said, "Well, I'm not going to help you until you put the damn money scenes back in." So this is one of those stories where miraculously somebody says something like that and the distributor actually does it. They put the scenes back in. They restored all the gore so that we could have the world premiere at the 183 in Irving. You know, so that story, sorry, I'm getting a little choked up just talking about that story, but I'll be okay. So the rest is history. Basket Case played unrated at drive-ins in the South, and then it ran for 2.5 years as the midnight movie at the Waverly Theater in Greenwich Village, which is where Frank lives, and the Waverly today is the IFC Cinema. And Frank and I became friends for life, and the cast of Basket Case all became, well, actually, the cast of Basket Case all went into other fields of endeavor, as they say. So I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't seen it, but I do want to point out that Frank dedicated the movie to Herschel Gordon Lewis, who nobody had heard of at that time in history, and that Frank made it for $35,000, which in today's money would be about $36,000. So it's not only a great low budget.
Now, again, ladies and gentlemen, that's Joe Bob just being very humorous, saying that these independent low-budget horror movies probably would still be around the same low budget in today's standards. Of course, this is season 1 in 2018. So we've moved on a couple years as well from 2018. Again, most of your low-budget horror movies today are getting filmed for around $500K, like $500,000 to about $1 million.
Budget movie. It's a great micro-budget movie. And Basket Case is the sensitive story of two Siamese twin brothers, and one of them looks like a squashed octopus and lives in a picnic basket that his brother carries around while feeding him Big Macs in a Times Square hotel room. And whenever anybody opens up the basket, they get their face chewed off. So a romantic comedy for the 80s, because these Siamese twins weren't separated at birth. They were separated at 12. So the smaller, sexually deviant Siamese twin, when separated from his more presentable brother in a graphic surgical procedure that doesn't quite work, is now having some parental hatred issues, not to mention fraternal jealousy when a female with giant garbanzos enters the picture. Kevin Van Hentenryck plays the lead as Dwayne, but the supporting cast is great too. Terry Susan Smith is the breasty blonde receptionist who falls in love with Dwayne before discovering his brother likes her more. Beverly Bonner is the nastiest hooker on 42nd Street, and Robert Vogel is the intimidating hotel clerk. So let's look at those drive-in totals. We have 10 dead bodies, 6 breasts, multiple face clawing, gut ripping with body part scattering, 7 gallons of blood with splatter, monster tantrum, toilet bonding scene, violent bloody non-elective surgery, buzzsaw daddy splitting, 2 attempted monster rapes, orange panty fondling, gratuitous kung fu, gratuitous Statue of Liberty romantic date jazz montage, interlude, burger foo, Times Square foo, hot dog foo, migraine foo, scalpel foo. Driving Academy Award nominations for Robert Vogel, the bald hotel manager who says, $20 a night in advance, no junkies. Kevin Van Hentenryck.
$20 a night in advance, no junkies.
As the curly-headed psychic kid from upstate with a secret who goes full frontal in the big closing scene. Beverly Bonner as the hooker neighbor who says, "You've got 2 seconds before I start pounding on this door." Terry Susan Smith as the goofy blonde who says, "I get off tonight at 7, hint, hint." Diana Brown as Dr. Cutter, the vet who goes upstate to do a little elective Siamese twin separation for saying, "That's all right, I like you drunk, you're cute when you slobber." Carrie Ruff as the police detective who says, "Have any pets? Any animals in there?" And of course, Frank Henenlotter, the writer-director, who went on to sin many more times in one of the strangest drive-in careers, even by New York standards. 4 stars. Joe Bob says, check it out.
Joe Bob says
And
it's a
watch here at the
4-star
first,
movie.
When Dwayne is walking down 42nd Street with that picnic basket, a drug dealer comes up to him and he does this amazing poetic rant featuring every drug known to man and several other vices as well. And those guys still exist in New York. But my favorite one was this guy in Washington Square Park. And he used to just say, smoke, 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 smoke. Every time you walk past him, smoke, smoke, smoke. But I saw him recently, and I've known him for years, and I walked over to say hi. And he said, Echo Tours, Echo Tours. He was selling echo tours. What is an echo tour anyway? Ecology tours. He was selling these day trips to raft down the Delaware River. They bus you across Jersey, you paddle around the Delaware River, they bring you back. And I'm like, you went from smoke, smoke to echo tours? And he was like, Trump ruins everything. I don't know what that means. That's just what he said. It's New York. He's an entrepreneur. He knows what turns people on. It's lame, you know. It's representative of a decline in civilization, but what turns people on right now is echo tours.
People wanted them Echo Tours in 2018. So here we go. First segment break. 23 minutes into the movie Basket Case. Let's hear what Joe Bob has to say.
Damn, don't you miss the real 42nd Street? I knew all those theaters. My favorite was Always 3 Kung Fu Hits. I don't even know what the actual name of the theater was. To me, it was Always 3 Kung Fu Hits. That's the only thing that was on the marquee. You could sit in there all day watching movies and people would bring you whatever you wanted, if you know what I mean, and I think you do. So anyway, Frank Henenlotter, the director, intended this partly as an homage to the glory years of 42nd Street, which of course means that by 1982, the glory years were sort of ending. They had another theater there that I was afraid to go into called Live Sex Act. That was on the marquee every day. But they didn't say who, what, or how this live sex act took place. So it sounded too much like, you know, it might be one of those donkey things from Cuba. So to me, that was terrifying. So anyhow, that's Kevin Van Hittenrick playing Dwayne with the great rock star hair and the innocent face and that deer on the first day of season attitude. You know, where are you from? Upstate. What's in the basket? Clothes. It's brilliant script. Kevin today is a famous sculptor. He lives in the Woodstock, New York area, and he teaches sculpture, and he does monumental rock pieces. He did a Rip Van Winkle thing that's on top of Hunter Mountain. But here's the interesting thing about him. He's so crazy about Basket Case that he wants to do Basket Case 4, and he's writing the script for it even as we speak. And his reason is he thinks there are some things the two Siamese twin brothers have not worked out between themselves yet. So we'll talk about that later. Meanwhile, that was Terry Susan Smith as the goofy blonde receptionist, Beverly Bonner as the sly hooker in the walk-up hotel, and Robert Vogel as the tough hotel manager. All perfect casting. I'll share some more Basket Case trivia with you as the movie goes on. We're 24 minutes in. We hadn't even seen the monster yet, so roll it. Everybody that worked on this movie was kind of scarred for life by it, like Beverly Bonner, who was in both of the sequels, by the way. She was so obsessed with this movie that she wrote a play called Casey 30 Years Later, Casey being the name of her character in Basket Case. And in this play that she wrote, Casey is running a bar in the East Village, and she's managing a team of hookers, all of which are age 50 or over. Because, you know, who says a hooker has to be young? This is the 21st
Who says
century.
a hooker has to be young?
They got good lighting, and you're drunk anyway. So, not that I approve of that lifestyle,
All right, ladies and gentlemen, Basket Case, one of the shorter movies here for the Joe Bob movie watch along. 32 minutes, the next segment break.
Belial is the name of the monster in Basket Case, and it's always a little confusing as to how he actually kills his victims, since, you know, mobility, physics, whatever. And yet I find the story very convincing as a story, so who cares? Frank Henenlotter still keeps Belial in his house. And I have to say, even though you know it's some kind of rubber dummy, that's creepy. What Frank is a master of combining horror with comedy. So you take a movie like Night of the Creeps, which is half comedy, half horror, and it doesn't quite work. But Basket Case is 80% horror, 20% comedy, which is what you need.
Now I feel like the more horror, like the genre of horror kind of progressed, you know, you had some of the directors really trying to take shots and take risks at the start with like the violence and the gore and everything. But to actually appeal to more of a mainstream audience, to actually appeal more to like Hollywood and shit, I think personally that they would include things like comedy in their movies, so that way, they were still rated R. Some of them were still fucking gory as ever and violent as ever, but you had that mix of comedy in there, so that way audiences could at least sit through the entire movie. They could be fucking grossed out, or they could probably laugh their ass off. But it was like more of a mix in that between like the 80s and the 90s, because again, Hollywood really wasn't fond of these type of movies, this style, especially with gore and all the violence and everything. So I think comedy really got implemented more and more along the way, just so that the movies could get showed to wider audiences and everything. Again, you have to remember some of these movies were on a very low budget, probably like 35K, 50K, shit like that. So for them to make a profit, they had to appeal to audiences in some way, and I think the comedy factor is really what helped them out. In terms of even lasting to, years like today, like in 2024, I mean, we're still talking about Basket Case and stuff. So, if it wasn't for the comedy, would they have the reputation that they have today? Who knows?
The perfect formula. If you go in the other direction, like 80-20 comedy, you end up with Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, stuff like that. And true believers do not do that. Okay, Dwayne and Belial are back at the Hotel Broslin, ready for the next mission. And by the way, when I first watched this, I thought there really was a Hotel Broslin. Apparently not. Frank just hung a sign outside an industrial building in Soho and made it look like Times Square. So it seems to me that there should be a Hotel Broslin. Okay, back to the movie. The scuzzy street scenes, by the way, those were shot in the meatpacking district, which at the time was a neighborhood where they packed meat, as the name implies. I mean, today it's like an international jet setter, Apple store, $25,000 French purses, hotels named after Renaissance painters kind of place. But back when it really was the meatpacking district, they had these streetwalkers that you didn't know whether they were men or women or both. I mean, New York was kind of ahead of its time in that area. You can go down there and pay $50 and have a threesome with one person. You know what I mean? Don't think about it too much because you'll gross yourself out. But
next segment break for Basket Case. 47 minutes into the movie now.
The little brotherly makeup scene after Belial hides in the toilet. They did that really well. I love that cop. I don't know why he didn't have more of a career. I think he had small roles in 2 other movies. And I don't know why, but virtually nobody in this movie had much of a career after this movie, except in the sequels. Beverly Bonner and Kevin Van Hittenrick came back for the sequels. But Terry Susan Smith, never seen again. And by the way, the reason her hair looks so weird is that she had shaved her head and they had to use a blonde wig. She was in a punk band called the Tattooed Vegetables, and I guess they required her to be bald. And Frank was pissed because she had hair at the audition and then no hair when they started filming. So anyway, I like this. If I can't have a girlfriend, you can't have a girlfriend either. Part of the story that's developing here, especially with the romantic Gidget goes to the Statue of Liberty music. Very unexpected in a horror flick. Okay, back to the movie. Although I don't think people go to the Statue of Liberty on a first date, do they? They were talking about going up in the top of the statue, which I don't think they let you do that anymore. Terrorism, So I guess it was different in the early 80s. Most people, when they go to New York, they say, what can I see that's not touristy, Joe Bob? What's not touristy? What do they mean by that? I mean, you're a tourist, okay? Anything you see is by definition touristy. You want to look at winos in Brooklyn? We can do that. That's not touristy. How about jumping the East River and swim to Rikers Island and get chased off by the machine gun toting guards? That would be very non-touristy. The reason they're called tourist attractions is that it's interesting stuff that everybody wants to see. There's no secret stuff that New Yorkers are keeping from you, you know. If it's anything worth seeing, they're gonna get your money and they're gonna make you see it. So don't worry about it, okay? Jeez.
New York City wants the money, ladies and gentlemen, especially from those tourists. Next segment break, an hour and 2.
So we finally know the whole story of how Belial came to be living in a basket. And by the way, that bedtime story that the kind aunt reads to the brothers, that's a speech from the Shakespeare play, The Tempest. And the speech is made by Caliban, who is, of course, deformed and animalistic and lives in slavery. And why does he live in slavery? Because he's an attempted rapist. Wonder why that's in there. Oh, foreshadowing. Anyway, I love this part of the movie. Not just Daddy being sawed in half vertically, that's pretty good, but the whole scene where Dwayne and Casey are getting drunk in the bar and Dwayne starts telling the exact literal truth, and it's hysterically funny and creepy and then funny again. Excellent writing. One amazing thing about Basket Case is that they didn't have all the money together when they started filming. And in fact, you know that wad of cash that Dwayne keeps in the room? Frank Henenlotter says that was the entire budget of the movie. So they would shoot some scenes and then cut them together and use them to raise a little bit more money from people here and there. And so the movie was actually shot over a period of months, and yet it hangs together extremely well. All right, back to the classic from 1982, Basket Case. And that bar, that bar where Casey and Dwayne get drunk together, that's the old Hellfire Club on 10th Avenue, which was a scary sex club for gays, lesbians, transvestites, transsexuals, quattrosexuals, bearded ladies, guys named Shirley, ladies named Bruce, whatever. And they would run these commercials on cable access that had these buff bodies in close-up with sweat running off their rippling deltoids. And a guy with his deep voice like James Earl Jones, he would say, "Let's go down." Not come on down, but let's go down, lest you fail to understand what goes on in the Hellfire Club. And apparently the cast and crew really enjoyed the Hellfire Club because they stayed there an extra day or two to shoot those scenes in Dwayne's basement where his dad gets murdered. But you didn't really want to be in the basement of the Hellfire Club in 1982. Studio 54, yes. Hellfire Club, protective gear at all times. As Coach High once said, Coach High was my basketball coach. Always wear a cup, son.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, next segment break, an hour and 15 into the movie now, Basket Case. Coming down to the end of the episode here, guys.
Always keep your scalpel drawer tidy in case a deformed ex-patient wants to shove your face into it. But that's not even the creepiest moment so far. That moment where you see Belial inside the basket, breathing heavy as he fondles the orange panties. This is why Frank Henenlotter said in an interview, "I am a strange little person." And then just when you think the movie has gotten as kinky as you really want it to get, uncomfortably kinky, it goes to a whole new level. It goes to a level so bizarre that when they were shooting the climactic scene, the crew got grossed out and walked off the set and refused to work. So if you haven't seen it before, you do not know what's coming. You may think you do, but you don't. So let's go down to the ridiculously over-the-top, yet somehow amazingly satisfying conclusion to Basket Case. You know how everybody talks about how the Frankenstein monster only wants to be loved? Well, same thing here, only this is a monster who only wants to get laid. So it's a combination of Frankenstein and Porky's, in a sense. But we won't overanalyze it because if we do, we'll puke.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of the review after the end credits for Basket Case.
And so ends the gross out third act of Basket Case, with one brother remaining a virgin, but not the one you expected, linked in death as they were in life. That full frontal nude sequence, that was bold. I mean, originally we were supposed to see Belial move through the mean streets of the city to get to Sharon, but Frank Henenlotter had to face the fact that that would be really difficult and really expensive, because when Belial moved, they were using stop motion animation like those Ray Harryhausen monsters, and there's only so much you can do with that on a limited budget. So he came up with the idea of Belial's lust forming inside Dwayne's brain as a dream, and therefore Dwayne sees everything Belial is doing. And of course, if Belial is moving through the streets, he's naked, since he never wears clothes of any kind. So Frank called up Kevin Van Hittenrich and explained the concept, and he said, "Are you up for running through the streets of New York City with full nakedity?" And Kevin said, "I'll do it." So it was really, really cold when they shot it. So they would open the door to a van. Kevin would leap out and run a while, and then he would run back into the van and warm up. And shot by shot, they got the sequence. A sequence that, I may add, was a violation of the laws of the city of New York on many levels, which is just one more reason to love Basket Case. Frank Henenlotter would go on to make a career out of disturbing body imagery in movies like Brain Damage and Frankenhooker, not to mention the two Basket Case sequels, and he's working on a new movie even as we speak. And meanwhile, he also became the official curator and spokesman and commentator for great exploitation movies of the past. And he put together a documentary on the career of Herschel Gordon Lewis that is actually very, very good. It's called Herschel Gordon Lewis, Godfather of Gore. All right, coming up next on the all-night, all-day, 24-hour last drive-in Joe Bob Briggs Marathon is the greatest H.P. Lovecraft movie ever made, and there have been quite a few of those. And remember, if you stay up 24 hours and mess up your sleep schedule and lose your job on Monday morning, you do deserve some appreciation from us. We won't forget you. I'll inscribe your name on a pewter mug and toast you every time I drink a beer. Okay, we're rolling. Girl goes into her doctor's office for a checkup. As she takes off her blouse, the doctor notices a big red H on her chest. He says, "How'd you get that mark on your chest?" And she says, "Oh, my boyfriend went to Harvard, and he's so proud of it that he never takes off his Harvard sweatshirt, even when we make love. So I guess it leaves an impression." A couple days later, another girl comes in for a checkup, takes off her blouse. There's a big Y on her chest. "How'd you get that mark on your chest?" asked the doctor. "Oh, my boyfriend went to Yale, and he's so proud of it, he never takes off his Yale sweatshirt, even when we make love." A couple days later, another girl comes in for a checkup. As she takes off her blouse, the doctor notices a big green M on her chest. So the doctor says, "You have a boyfriend who went to Michigan?" And the girl says, "No, but I have a girlfriend at Wisconsin. Why do you ask?"
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to do it for the Joe Bob movie reviews tonight. Last Drive-In Season 1, 2018. That was episode 7 and 8. So tomorrow we will continue with 9 and 10, and then we will end the season with a big triple movie feature. It'll be 11, 12, and 13 to end Season 1, 2018 of The Last Drive-In with Joe Bob. And then after that, we're going to move right along into the July marathon. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, ghosts and goblins, witches and wizards, vampires and werewolves, for joining me tonight and watching some Joe Bob. I appreciate everybody being here. It means a lot to me. And we will be back tomorrow.